Howdy, I'm John, and I'm going to tell you what it's like for me to build on the X570 Aorus Master motherboard. First off, let me tell you, this is a really strong, durable board, and I picked all of these components for this build. The Master I picked on account of the PCIe 4.0 Express. And what is that? Well, it's the bus lanes that are between the components, between the CPU and the RAM, and the voltage regulator module, and the graphics card. All of these things have those little gold buses, they're called. They're kind of like golden trails that the electricity and the power goes through and all the data. And I guess with PCIe 4 generation 4, it's a lot stronger, it's a lot thicker, it's a lot heavier. For instance, this board is super heavy. It's got an extra layer or two of copper, and they're thicker than most so that they can handle more power going through them. This is a board that's built for being capable of overclocking. In fact, on the back is this heat shield that spreads and diffuses the heat, draws it away from the board itself. Also helps protect the board against ESD shock and being dragged across something. And so we've got an ESD bag that it comes in, and that's to protect it while it's in travel. And this is kind of the basic power plan of the thing. You got the CPU socket in the center. The CPU will hook into that socket, and all the pins will connect to the copper power plate below. But then you've got this voltage regulator module, which is that array of 14 chokes and 14 capacitors that feed the power to the CPU and some of the other components. That way they feed the beautiful, fine, deeply regulated and clean power without a lot of sine waves or anything in it. Very clean, pure power. Now, those chokes and capacitors are fed by a type of transistor called a MOSFET, which is underneath those heat fins. The MOSFETs will draw up some heat, and then they feed it through to the choke, which keeps it just the right amount, and then the capacitor is kind of like a little battery, and it makes sure that the perfect amount of energy is going to the CPU. Since it's split up among these 14 different phases, it makes it nice, easy on each of them so that they're able to feed the CPU a very huge amount of energy when it needs it very quickly without them getting overly hot. But the MOSFETs are surrounded by this very well engineered cooling system around them. They got thermal pads up against them. It just pulls all the heat away. Just make sure you got some airflow around there, and they'll keep those fins cooler, and they'll keep pulling that heat away from the MOSFETs. MOSFET stands for metal oxide semiconductor field effect transistor. So we're talking about how fast this PCIe 4 is. I mean, it's like an Autobahn. So what you've got is twice the speed of the PCIe 3, but all of the components have to be PCIe 4 ready. So for instance, the GPU we have is PCIe 4. The components in the board itself, though, between the RAM and the CPU and the voltage regulator assembly are all going to be PCIe 4. So you're going to have a lot of speed here. You just have to pick components that are going to be able to properly utilize it. Now let's take a look at some of the awesomeness of this. Well, you know, talk about that great big old socket there, and it's going to be fed power partly by the 24 pin, but the CPU itself is going to be by these 8x2 pins, and they'll be fed through the voltage regulator modules and fed through to the CPU at the proper ratio. Now you got like 1,000 pins are going to drop down into there and connect to the power plate that's below. They'll be feeding power up to the different cores of the CPU when it needs it. Notice when you pull this lever back, it slides this sled back and it opens and makes accessible the little slot that the pins will drop down into. Here's the pins. There's over 1,000 of them on an AM4 socket. And they give the power spread out through the CPU where it needs it without being a big assembly that's going to burst too much power into a tiny spot and burn something more. So this is really super good engineering. Talk about good engineering, I mean, look at the strong metal on these DIMM slots here for the memory modules. I mean, this is a type of board that's really built that you can utilize it as a benchmark tool and be swapping parts out all the time, because you could slide DIMM modules in and out of this thing 1,000 times without wearing it out. And it is pretty handy having the information printed right on the board so you know what slots to use if you're only going to use 2. Oh, and yeah, we're looking at the DIMM slots. Well, we got the same thing with the PCIe slots. I mean, when you hook a GPU to this giant metal shielded thing, it's not going to be so likely to be sagging. Yeah, it's a strong, tough board. When you pick it up, you feel it's substantial. It's like 50% heavier than other boards. Oh, it's even got a little Thunderbolt header there too. And we got 6 Sata ports here. And that's pretty handy. The top 4 are hooked in with PCIe 4 Express. And I think it works to where if you hook the bottom 2 in, you can't use the bottom M.2. So I'm only using 2. Having an M.2 right in the motherboard makes the computer very fast, very responsive. Oh, now we're talking about the audio part. Now this ought to be one of my favorite parts because I do so love music. And you've got these transistors from Japan. They're said to be among the best in the world. I mean, it's like, how'd they get this into a fairly moderately priced board for the quality you have? And you even have gold pins on the back so that you get the best with connection and not much aging gonna happen on it. Speaking of the back I/O, you got a lot of different things here. Great Wi-Fi, that's also gold. You got a couple different features on this board that makes it worth having and worth looking at. Well, let's look at these M.2 modules here. I mean, that's a sweet thing to be able to put some of those in. But right now I'm only using PCIe 3 style because PCIe 4 style are really super expensive. And the speed difference is substantial, but I'm gonna suffer through for a year or 2 until the price comes down a bit. Now, what do you got on this here board all over that you can plug things in? Well, we got some CPU fans right at the top where you'd expect to plug your CPU fans in. And it's also designed to be able to work with water cooling. We've got a 12 volt 4-pin at the top and one at the bottom, and as well as a 3-pin 5 volt at the top and the bottom also. Oh, and you got some a starting button and a reset button, as well as BIOS switches that you can do right from a bench if you're going to be working it that way. Oh, and you got all kinds of little great things that work with this board here, and you can even use probes if you want to play technician and check all the lanes and everything. And here's how this all hooks together when it's in the board. We've got some CPU fans plugged in. We got 12 4-volt. There's a temperature sensor that's plugged in. We've got the little label that glows and lets us know different things that wants to give us the codes. There we got another temperature sensor and some fans plugged in. There's a USB 3.2 plugged in. We got a 3.1 plugged in at the bottom here, as well as the front input wires they go into this really cool little header adapter. That way you can work on them outside of the case, work on those tiny little things. You almost need tweezers to put them in place, and then you can just plug the whole header in nice and easy. I mean, they're making things so much easier for the common person to be able to build their own computer. You ought to give it a try. Go ahead and subscribe, and you can watch all of my videos as I make them with the computer that I built for editing. Make sure you have your keyways in always the right way. That way you won't bend your pins and hurt things. Now, continuing on the bottom, we got a couple USB 3 ports. There's another temperature sensor, regular USBs, mainly internal. There's a trusted platform module thing if you're into all that sort of stuff. There's our other 5 and 12 volt RGB, and at the bottom was also an audio. But this is the way it all works out. Now, the thing to remember about a motherboard is it is basically more like the chassis of a car. Everything hooks to it. You got the linkage hooking to it, transmission, engine, everything's running along it, wired to it, the axle and springs, and if you've got a good strong engine, tranny, and rear end, but the frame is no good and it just can't handle the power, you're going to get body bending. So your best bet is to have everything matching. You really have to have matching components. If you're going to build an editing machine, you've got to have a good CPU. You got to have a lot of RAM. You got to have a good GPU. That means you've also got to have a good cooling unit. And you'd better tie that all together with a good motherboard and a reliable and properly matched power supply, and stick it in a case that fits. So folks, go ahead and like and subscribe and follow the rest of the journey for building this great, awesome computer.